incredibly lucky that we're going to get to see some of our wonderful Chicago architecture on a boat on the Chicago River. And I say this because the river that you're about to travel down right now, this is the reason the city exists. If you'd like to, as we start, that this entire city start to spin around, survey this panorama of all of these skyscrapers that you'll go through in this beautiful twilight night. Imagine with me, if you could have come here hundreds of years ago, way back in the 1600s, you might wonder what on earth you would have found. Of course, none of these tall buildings would have been here yet, and the answer would have been a swamp. Most of this area was marshy swampland. And there are, of course, Native Americans who lived in this region. They were called the Potawatomi tribe. But the Potawatomi, they didn't bother to settle what we call Chicago. And there were some really good reasons for this. It has a really short growing season, and so it's difficult to farm very successfully in this area. It also, got a taste of this earlier today, it has temperature extremes. And the whole city is located along this pretty extremely windy body of water, Lake Michigan. So the Potawatomi, well, they didn't bother to settle what we call Chicago. They did name this area with 3 words from their language, and these are pronounced roughly Chicago, so if that sounds like Chicago to you, that's of course where the name of the city. If you were to translate this, what it means is stinky onion place. And so the name of our beautiful city that you're heading into, this actually referred to the way that it smelled. Well, in 1670 comes from, but in 73, we had sort of an unlikely pair of Frenchmen come into this area. They were Marquette, he was a Jesuit missionary priest, and Joliet, a French explorer. Into this area, the French government sent them hundreds of years ago and asked them to try to link together 2 existing North American water routes. We'd already had Europeans travel down the St. Lawrence Seaway in Canada, arrive up here at the Great Lakes. Other Europeans had gone to the Mississippi, followed that down to its end in the Gulf of Mexico. But in 1673, you know, if you needed to go from one of these to the other, you had to actually pick up your canoe and carry it yourself over land. This was called portage. And I can only imagine it was pretty incredibly exhausting. It was also really, really inefficient. So Marquette and Joliet came into this area trying to find a faster way for people to travel through it. Well, they got a tip from a friendly Potawatomi guide about another swamp. This one's just southwest of downtown. It's near where Midway Airport is. Right? Out of Midway. This swamp links up to the Des Plaines River, which a little farther west of that links up to the Illinois River, which just a little farther west of that links up to the Mississippi. And so with the quote-unquote discovery of this swamp, Marquette and Joliet, they were able to go across the entire continent by water and establish a trade route. And so Chicago, the city you're getting into, this came about. Well, of course, anytime you have a big group of people all starting to settle in the same area, you have some of the problems of modern cities that come up. And not the least of these is what you do with all of your populations. Trash and sewage. There are no modern sewer systems in North America.
Straight right side
and so when this area was first being settled, people would just throw all of their trash and their sewage directly into the Chicago River, which at that time, it flowed out behind you into Lake Michigan, which like it still is today, it's the city's source of drinking water. And so they were polluting their own drinking water. This started to lead to a lot of health epidemics, cholera, typhus, and a large percentage of the population in this area started to die from disease. So some engineers set out to try and solve this public health problem, and the very unusual solution that they came up with was to reverse the direction of the Chicago River. They did this, they dredged the riverbed to change the angle, and they also did a huge canal at south of here, you can't see it, to help control the water flow. And so right now, you are traveling on the Chicago River in the opposite direction from the way that nature intended for it to flow. And you'll see this fountain just off to our right. This is Centennial Fountain. This was put here to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of this historic engineering feat, of the successful reversal of the river. They completed this project in 1900. But we'll come across your first building, since you are an architectural cruise. On the right, you'll see this building with the rounded corners. This is the Sheraton Hotel and Towers. It's the 4th largest hotel in town. And this will be your first brush with a style that you'll see a lot along the river tonight called postmodernism. And one of the main things that postmodernist architects attempted to do was to reference history or other ideas in their designs. So the Sheridan with these rounded corners, it's honoring a much older Chicago building. That's the Carson Curie Scott department store downtown on State Street, which closed last year, which was designed by Louis Sullivan. Sullivan is a very famous architect from this region. He was one of the founders of the Chicago school style of design. As you pass that, notice how the greenish panes of windows, glass in the windows rather, this is a really postmodern detail, and you'll see this get repeated in a lot of the buildings that are built along the river in this period. But you've got a skyscraper waiting for you just beyond this next bridge. You'll see a building coming up. It has these black glass recessed windows that shoot up into the sky in lines. This is the NBC Tower just off to our right. Home to NBC Networks downtown, designed by Idreamz from Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. That's a firm name that you'll hear a lot in any Chicago architectural trip. If you look about 3/4 of the way up where those lights are coming on, you'll see these spans with the space in between. This is a modern, streamlined take on a Gothic load-bearing arch called a flying buttress. And you'll see some deceptively more traditional looking ones just down the street in a minute. That whole building may remind you of Rockefeller Center from Manhattan if you've seen that. It has a really similar external silhouette. You'll see next this sort of off-kilter greenish glass box around the University of Chicago's Graduate School of Business. And as we pass this, notice this jagged wall that has no windows. These are all classrooms. And someone asked one of the architects from Loan and Associates when they were designing this, are you really going to build classrooms with no windows? To which you can see they replied, the students are here to study. And so if you go over there, you can't daydream or look out the window. You'll see set back a little ways next this Indiana limestone building, the Chicago Tribune, home to the Tribune newspaper offices downtown. This was the winning entry in a design competition sponsored by its publisher, Curtis McCormick, in the early 1920s. He chose that design from the New York firm Howells and Hood to construct. If you look up at the top of the Tribune, you can see what appears to be a more traditional looking flying buttress, except that those are cast out of concrete, which was a newer building technology at the beginning of the last century. Just across Michigan Avenue, you'll see the light starting to come up on this beautiful white terracotta facade of the Wrigley building. This was built with the money from the Wrigley chewing gum family empire. It's based on Spanish Renaissance architecture. If you notice the clock tower way up there, look extra closely up at the base of it, and you'll see that those aren't numbers. They're W's up there, squished together, or the last name Wrigley. You'll see a kind of messy, unfinished building next off to the right. If you've wondered where Donald Trump is building his first Chicago skyscraper, this is the site right in front of us. The delivery date to finish this, it's still set currently in 2009. And so you can see they've been hard at work on about the first 2/3 of the entire building. If you see this black glass and steel box that peeks out just beyond it, this is the IBM building. That's 50 stories. The Trump building, when they finish this, it's going to be 92. And so it'll be pretty much twice the height of anything else in this neighborhood. The IBM building just beyond it, this was designed by a German expatriate, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe left Germany just before World War II began, and luckily for Chicago, he came here. Sometimes we call him the father of modernism. And one of the tenets of that style that you may have heard before is the saying, less is more. Mies van der Rohe, he once said that God was in the details.
Parking is.
He doesn't feel the need to ornament the exterior of this. He thought that the physics of a building's structure, that this was decoration enough. That's his tallest North American building. It was completed in the 1970s. Just beyond the IBM building, you'll get to see next to its complete opposite coming up. There are these two very unusual curvy towers. These are Marina City, designed by Bertrand Goldberg. And Goldberg studied under Mies van der Rohe, so you can see the teacher's design and then the students right next to it. Well, Goldberg, he rejected this box-like modernist architectural style. He said once that boxes were psychological slums. So he was really concerned with how his design would affect whoever had to live or work inside of it. You can see if you live here, you can dock your boat, park your car, go up and sit on your balcony. Then you can eat in a restaurant. Then you can go bowling. And then, if you're not too tired after all of that, you can go hear a concert in the House of Blues concert hall. You'll be able to see the lights on the blue marquee off to the right over there. That club's in the basement. So you can do all of those things without ever leaving those two structures here downtown. Well, since Chicago, it's sprung up along a trade route, you might expect to find a lot of warehouses along this one's really functional body of water. And we'll come up on a classic red brick Chicago brick warehouse. It's just off to the right of this next bridge. This building, it'll give you some idea of what most of this entire area would have looked like if you couldn't come here back during the major industrial use of the river. This building's name is the Reed Burdock Building. You can kind of tell over by where this white life preserver is maybe, there would have been a dock originally where you could have pulled your boat up to load goods onto it to ship out to the rest of the country. If you look up, you'll see those pin lights coming on, illuminating these little geometric decorations. They're referencing Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie School of Architecture, which took a lot of its inspiration from Native American design from tribes that were here in the Midwest. You'll see on the next completed building on the right, pretty conveniently it says the Chicago School about half the way up. This is a great postmodern take on Sullivan's Chicago School style. Sullivan thought that building should look more human, and so you can see this has feet by where those trees are planted, a shaft like a body, and then way up at the top a round structure like the head on a person. This round room up here, this is a boardroom where CEOs meet, but these architects are trying to make this look like the bow or the front of a boat, and so they're referencing the river deliberately in that architectural renovation. You'll see next this massive Art Deco building, the Merchandise Mart. When the Merchandise Mart was built, this was the largest building in the entire world per square foot until the Pentagon was constructed. This is so big that currently it has its own zip code from the Chicago Post Office. It was originally built by Marshall Field as a warehouse for his dry goods business. So if you see all these bronze busts, these gentlemen's heads that line this promenade, these are some of the merchant princes who helped build Chicago. Sears, Wanamaker, Marshall Field, and David Letterman once called this the Pez Hall of Fame. You see the like giant Pez candy dispensers along the river? Joseph Kennedy of the Kennedys purchased that for a fraction of what it had cost to build when the property value declined after the Great Depression. So the Kennedy family owned that up until the late 1990s. Today it's mostly home to wholesale design material showrooms, along with part of its sister building, the Apparel Center, just off to our right. This is from the late 70s, but you can see they're connected by that walkway. And you can see from the front of this is the newer home to the Chicago Sun-Times offices, our other major daily newspaper here in town. If you take a look around on this beautiful evening, you'll see we've come to the end of the main part of the river, and we'll go up the North Branch now a little ways. But as we do, notice this little grassy curve that you'll go around. This is a really important part of Chicago. It's called Wolf Point, and this is where Chicago was incorporated on March 4th of 1837. So if you could have come here way back then, you would have found our first tavern over here. Just across the river, the first hotel and another tavern. And there was a ferry, which was basically a horse and a raft. So if you needed to cross the river back then, you jump on a raft over here and kind of take your chances going back and forth across. A lot of this real estate that's riverside, it's become desirable for residential use only a lot more recently. You can see in front of us and then on your left these newer riverbend condominiums. These were designed by James DiStefano. They were built here downtown in 2002. If you wonder, how much it would cost to live in a place like this, I looked this building up online. Every single unit in here begins in the millions and up, so pretty expensive place to live. I bet the view up there is spectacular though. There's sort of a light peach color building just north of Riverbend. This one is a Chicago building originally built with no windows whatsoever. The walls on this, they were about 6 feet thick, and they were insulated in between with horsehair. And that's because this was a cold storage warehouse, and so they used this before modern refrigeration technology to store meat, ice, other perishable items like that. Well, when Harry Weiss is the architect that renovated this to the state you can see in front of us right now, when he set out to do this, he not only had to invent a new kind of drill bit to get through those thick walls, he also had to wait almost an entire year just for this building to defrost before he could start working on it because they kept it frozen for so long. Harry Weiss also designed these charming little river cottages. He was a sailor as well as an architect, so you can see he put a lot of nautical detail into these designs. And notice all the triangles that you'll see repeated throughout these buildings. This was his favorite geometric form to use, and he repeats the triangle all throughout the city. And so if you'd like to, in a minute, when you come out from under this bridge, take a quick peek back, and you'll be able to see just how dramatically he gabled those roofs that if you're walking by at the street level, they look like the sails on two sailboats downtown. There's even more newer residential growth. Also on your left, you'll see these squat red brick Kinsey condominiums. When the builders submitted these plans to the city okayed this design that you can see in front of us tonight, but Chicago put two conditions onto it. One was that it had to be set back from the river the way that it is, and this was so that too it could include this promenade or this public walkway that you see. And this is because Chicago, we've started to try and establish a network of river walkways like this one. Hopefully we'll extend them all along the banks of the river as far as we can and link them up together. This idea was inspired in part because in the mid-1990s, the EPA changed the status on the Chicago River from toxic to merely hazardously polluted. And so, stay on the boat. We've been trying really, really hard, slowly but surely, trying to clean up the river after centuries of industrial use and pollution. And the city's been trying to make the area near it. Hopefully it'll be a little bit of a friendlier place for people to spend some time, the cleaner and cleaner it gets. So we'll turn around to the north branch of the river, and we'll go south. We'll go quite a ways down the south branch now. If you look a little ways ahead of us by where those red lights are on the bridge foundation in front of us, you'll see these big bundled objects. They have these rusty chains wrapped around them. Those are called pilings, and they're put there to protect that bridge foundation from boats like us. But we're approaching the site of the origin of a pretty recent Chicago disaster, the Great Chicago Flood of 1993. It started just a little ways ahead of us. What happened? We had a city worker, he was working near one of these pilings. Well, he slipped and he punctured a hole. What he unknowingly punctured a hole into were a series of abandoned coal tunnels from back when the city used coal as a major fuel source. These tunnels, even right now, they still network all beneath downtown. So if you want to imagine this, a leak sprung up right over here, then a giant whirlpool formed, and suddenly millions and millions of gallons of this river water that you're floating on rushed in and flooded the basements of most of downtown Chicago. It flooded the basement of Marshall Field's department store, and there were fish swimming in and out of the clothing that was still hanging for sale, if you want to imagine that. They had to shut down the subway and evacuate a lot of the downtown businesses that you can see in front of us. It cost the city over $1 million to clean up the mess, all from a little leak that sprung up right back here. If you listen for a minute, you can hear a train off to our right. I think it's coming out of downtown. With the advent of the railroad system in North America, Chicago became a major railway hub. And so there's about 10 to 15 active train lines off to our right at any given time. And you'll see all these tracks, they'll snake in from the north and the west. They'll all converge down here at a southern point in the city. We'll pass it in a few minutes. Well, once the United States started to build all these railroad lines, beginning in the mid-1860s and later, and then in the 1920s, we had not only the desire, but finally the technology to build skyscrapers. This brought up a newer building issue. It's called air rights. And all air rights refers to is, you just sell the air over your train tracks to build over. So a lot of downtown that you go through now, you can actually see a silvery train over here. kind of trailing us on the right side. It's constructed in this way over the air rights to all of these railroad lines you can see. This is when they're able to have all these layers of a city coexisting. You can have the transportation systems and the commercial downtown in the exact same location when you build this way. But you'll see this gray building coming up on the right. It has almost looks like a little travel alarm clock on the left side of it. This today is Boeing's international headquarters. This was designed by a local architect, Ralph Johnson, from Perkins & Will Associates. It was built here downtown in 1990. You'll be able to see in a minute how all these railroad tracks, they head directly underneath the building. When Ralph Johnson set out to build this, he got some bad news because part of the plan for that, it's located over a switching station, which is a really sensitive area of railroad track. It has a lot of signal, a lot of information going through it. So he found out he couldn't put foundation into the ground for part of this building. So we had to figure out, how on earth you build a building like the one we're looking at if you can't hold part of it up from underneath. Well, he solved this really, really ingeniously, and you'll get to see in just a second exactly how he did this. What he did on this design, he hung part of the building from a huge cantilever truss system. A cantilever truss, it's a lot like a big diving board if you want to think of it that way. So it's been spring-loaded to bear weight. So if you look over here, you can see this great facade. This is hiding train tracks from us. Over here on the southern end where the stairs lead up, the facade and the columns, they're all decorative. It's not structurally serving to hold up anything. They just thought if people were walking around like these people and they could tell the building is hanging in midair, that this would scare them. So they put this up on that side to reassure the pedestrians, and he left this engineering exposed, so if you'd like to, you can see it in a minute. If you feel like it, take a quick peek back when you come up under the bridge and you'll see a big silvery box with an X. This is the edge of the cantilever truss system, holding part of that building up from above. Farther away from us, it's weighted to hold up the side closer to the diving board.
Sure.
On that side of it. The right side being held up right on that side of Well, Governor has a series of buildings all on your right. Now, we'll show you the shift from the modernist style into the postmodernist. They have sort of unimaginative names, though. This first black glass and steel office box that you're passing, its name is Gateway 1. Gateway 1 has an identical twin coming up over here just across the street from it. Gateway 2, the white building just on the horizon is Gateway 3. There's a squat black box just beyond that, jutting out, that's Gateway 4. And you can probably guess the name of the last building yourself, of course it's Gateway 5. And while they don't have the most descriptive names, they are a really good example of Mies van der Rohe's modernist influence on these commercial office buildings downtown. Sometimes modernism, it also gets called the international style, and that's because these buildings, as stark or as plain as they may seem, they're intended to be able to be built in any city, anywhere in the entire world, and hopefully they'll fit in or mesh with the architecture that you'd already find wherever you're building. You can see the doorway to Union Station just off to the right. So this is where you access all these railroad tracks you can see running underneath downtown. If you look a little ways ahead of us at Gateway 4, you can see up close the diagonal load transference engineering that Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill used to build the Hancock. This is like a little piece of that. And so all this means is the weight of this, it's been transferred to be held up diagonally on the walls instead of vertically. This allows them to use a lot less building material, and so it's more efficient, and it'll maximize the floor space that you then have available inside that design, because the building's being held up by the exterior wall, so it's more efficient. You can sort of imagine you've time traveled a little bit later into the post-modern era when you get down here at Gateway 5. This was designed by James DiStefano. And you can see he's pretty clearly deliberately curved that dark bluish green glass facade, so it would have echoed the curve in the river that's almost exactly the same color when this was first built. It's pretty much falling apart in front of us tonight. But you can see all the geese, they like to hang out over there. It's sort of like a geese holiday inn. There's a monolith of a Chicago building waiting for you just beyond this next bridge. This is the former Chicago Central Post Office coming up. And when this was built in the early 1930s, this was the largest post office in the entire world. They built this at that size to try and anticipate all the catalog and mail order trade that would have come out of the city. Because we had Sears Roebuck based here, Montgomery Ward's here. So if you ordered something from one of those catalogs, they'd send it to you out of this giant post office. If you look at the windows, it looks a little out of use. It's no longer used by the city. They realized that to retrofit that older building, to put in all the technology that they need to process all the mail in a huge city like Chicago today, it would be so expensive. They stopped using that right now, and there's a big debate going on as to what to do with it. Split it up, and there's very little you're allowed to do to alter the main structure of it. So it's really hard to find a use for something that huge. Right now it's empty and they're debating what to do with it. They built an entirely new central postal annex over here just across the street from it because it was cheaper to do that than it was to try to retrofit the older building. It's kind of fun. They filmed part of the new Batman movie in front of that last summer. So if you go see that when it comes out next month, check it out, see if you recognize our big sort of spooky post office. Some of the scenes we had Batman running around in front of it. This is our new central postal annex over here, just across the street. This is the post office that's somewhat secretly open 24 hours, and you need to get something postmarked. You have to run down here in the middle of the night, and they'll ask you how you found out it was open. They don't want you to know. If you were to go overland a little ways just beyond the new postal annex, you would come across the site of the origin of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The O'Leary farmstead, which is where poor Mrs. O'Leary's cow was blamed for kicking over a lantern and burning down most of downtown Chicago. It was just off a little ways over here in the distance. They both eventually were publicly lifted of blame for starting the fire, but unfortunately they died years and years before that happened. So we don't know what started the Great Fire in town. What we do know is at the time the majority of the city was built out of wood. There were thousands of wooden, prefabricated balloon frame houses. And there were about 55 miles of planked wooden streets because we didn't pave streets yet. And in October of that year, there was a drought. So if you want to imagine this, something right over here set off a spark, flames shot up. Well, on that day, there were very, very high winds. They were so high, they were able to blow the fire across the river. It set downtown on fire. It burned over 80,000 buildings. At the time, people thought this was the end of Chicago. Poet John Greenleaf Whittier, he even went so far, he wrote the city a eulogy in which he said, the great city of the West is dead. But fortunately, they were able to rebuild the majority of downtown within only about 2 years or so. So there was a pretty quick recovery from that disaster. Oh, I love it when you go down this far. When you pass this building just off to the right, there's another building. It's got an orange north-facing wall over here. It's by this, there's 2 radio towers, I think. Yeah, it's the one with the light on the top of it. This is the vicinity of the O'Leary farmstead, where we now somewhat poetically we have the Chicago Firefighters Training Academy. So we trained some of our firefighters right down here, where the city started to burn. Maybe for good luck, just in case. We're going to start to turn around for you in the South Branch. And if you haven't already, take a look back where you just came from. And you'll get your first glimpse from this amazing view of what was the world's tallest building until 1997. That black fastened steel building looming up in front of you is the Sears Tower. And if you want to stand up to take a photo, if you want to come up front here, go right ahead. Just be careful because it gets really slippery on the boat when it's wet. Come on up.
Yeah, tallest building. కాదు. Oh, I don't remember. UAEలో ఉంది. ఓకే, ఒక్కొక్కటి రండి. దట్స్ షికాగో అని అనండి. మస్తు అయిపోయింది.
The Sears Tower in front of you, it's 1,454 feet. So that building is 110 stories, scraping that beautiful summer sky in front of you.
నీ వెనకాల సిగర్ స్టార్స్
It was built by a brilliant team. Bruce Graham was the main architect and Isaac Thorne, the structural engineer from Skidmore, Owings and Merrill.
దట్స్ షికాగో. అందరూ పెట్టండి. 20 నిమిషాలు 30 నిమిషాలు.